All right. We're a minute past four. Let's kick things off. And today we're going to be talking about, do we still need L&D? I know this feels like a bit of an existential question to be asking. This is not to scare you into a career change. We're not giving career advice around other job roles you should be doing in your organization. It's really to kind of look at the state of affairs today. What does it mean for L&D to make sense out of it? To understand the risks if we don't change in the L&D function, and how we can go about making changes and to remain relevant looking into the future of work. And I'm joined by Kasper. Kasper, it's me and you again.
Yes, nice to re-meet you, Nelson.
Fortunately for us, it is by a bit of popular demand. People liked us together last time and they wanted us to tackle a much bigger question. And so we've really got a challenge today talking about, do we still need L&D?
Yeah.
So I hope you're ready for this one. I thought let's kick things off, Kasper, with why are we even asking this question? Why are we asking this question of, do we still need L&D? Is it, if it carries on its current form, is there going to be a struggle to remain relevant? Why is this coming up now?
Yeah, so I think that part of that question actually is driven by the rise of AI, which changes a lot and maybe challenges things that we do as L&D. But it's a question that's already relevant for a longer time. So it's not new, but it's become more actual with AI. And the question is basically, is L&D in trouble? And the thing is that if you are just doing top-down driven training, so then I'm talking about the mandatory training like compliance training, security training, the training on the corporate culture, well, you know what I'm talking about, those kind of training. Those are all things that are must-haves. You need to do that as L&D, of course. So we are not telling you to stop that, but they do not deliver real business value. It's sort of something that you need to do, and you need to check that box. Okay, done. And then you go about the business that really impacts the learning that impacts the business. And that is what a lot of people are not doing. And now with AI rising, a lot of those mandatory trainings, you could replace them in the future maybe by content created by AI. But if you are talking about specific training that impacts performance, then it's not. So if you're not in that area, then your department or even maybe your job might be at risk. And I think AI is therefore sort of bringing this question to the surface.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think often sometimes people kind of mistake these individual steps and they think that you're still going to need a human who, even if you take kind of operational use cases of compliance or onboarding, and they think, oh, you're still going to need an L&D human to be able to kind of orchestrate these things. But people who are following what's happening in generative AI with agents, for example, and for those of you who are not familiar with this idea of kind of AI agents, it's essentially a series of workflows that are connected together, and AI can basically make autonomous decisions to run the entire workflow. And so, it is very, very likely in the next couple of years, we're looking at those kind of core operational use cases being run purely by an AI agent end to end, and ticking that box, like Kasper mentioned. And so what that kind of really raises the question of, if that is all you're doing, then the chances are you are going to become irrelevant, because the business will find a far more effective and efficient way of being able to do that. And I guess it kind of raises the question, what are some of the other things that L&D are doing today, Kasper, that you think puts them at risk of becoming irrelevant? I mean, one of the things I often come across is still this idea of training needs analysis, right? Like this, I mean, me going to the business once a year, twice a year, going, tell me what training you need. And they kind of self-prescribe, going, I think I need training A and B, rather than focusing on what are the business challenges and performance needs that the business is going to. And I feel like this behavior is one that, if L&D don't change, people in that function can very quickly find themselves irrelevant because they're no longer speaking what the business cares about. Like that, do you see any other kind of traits and behaviors of kind of L&D teams and professionals?
Yeah, so I think that in general, it is if you see yourself as a function that serves the business. So you're separate from the business, so you are not part of the business. You can recognize that. So if your success criteria is like how many people follow this training and how many people got a certificate, then those are not real business goals. So then probably you're next to the business. And I was recently having discussion on LinkedIn. So I posted something that L&D should not, because we need to, you hear very often that we should align more with the business goals. And I don't think that we should align with the business goal. I think that L&D should become part of the business. So, and the interesting thing is with the whole thing of AI, we know that we can do better. We know that we can have more impact. And right now, basically, there's a window of opportunity with AI. Things are going to change, and you can actually use that change to reposition L&D and make it part of the business, help drive innovation, help people develop new skills, and help solve problems that stop people from being productive, and help to increase productivity, because that's where you need to go. And all those check the box things like the mandatory training. So yeah, I don't say forget about it, but that's not where you make the
Yeah, yeah.
difference.
I think a big part of that comes from also speaking the language of the business, right? Like going back to your point around what are we measuring, what are we reporting back on? I still see many L&D teams reporting and talking about time spent learning and course completion as the metrics that they share with the wider
Correct.
business. But the reality is neither the workforce or your C-suite care about how many courses someone's completed or the time spent learning, right? And I think in order for us to become relevant, but also, like you said, integrated into the business, we need to speak a language the rest of the business understands. And, we're big advocates here for kind of talking about skills, because I do think it's that connective tissue that both the C-suite understand. If you went to a CEO and said, people have spent 40 hours learning, the CEO doesn't care. But if you told the CEO that actually we don't have skills X, Y, Z, and we need those skills in order to achieve our OKR and deliver our strategy, now they do care. And I think the same is true for employees. You go to the employee and say, you've not done 40 hours learning today, they don't care. But if you go to an employee and say, you don't have the skills to do your job today, and you don't have the skills to be able to progress in your career, now they do care. And I think in order for us to be integrated into the business and become more relevant, we need to start speaking the language of the organization rather than using L&D speak, so to speak, and kind of getting other people to care about that. And it kind of moves on to, how do we tackle these things, right? And I know one of the key things when we were discussing this, Kasper, we were speaking about is context, right? Almost
Correct.
historically, the traditional model for learning and development has been very kind of content focused. It's almost pushing out content without really thinking about context. And it's that context that makes the content relevant to that individual in the organization. And I know you're doing a lot of work in developing a model around this, and it'd be great to kind of hear a bit more around your thinking around this model and how it can support L&D teams to bring that context into designing their learning strategy and experiences.
Yeah. So indeed, a context is crucial here for learning. So I am working on a model. It's not finished, but work in progress. But where I am currently, so I call that new form of learning contextual learning, because a lot of people are talking about that we need to go to skills-based training, but that sort of suggests that you leave out the knowledge-based training that we're now mostly doing and transfer into skills-based learning. And that is not the case, because I think that the learning, and that's why I call it contextual learning, should have three components. So it is information, knowledge transfer. So you need to learn things. But then you also, and that's what we leave out now very often, also need to learn how to actually be able to apply that. So somebody needs to tell you or show you in the training, in the learning, how you can actually, what kind of skills you need to apply that knowledge and how you apply that. And then in the ideal situation, you would even be able in the learning to practice that. For example, if you have a scenario, you are placed in a situation, you can actually use the knowledge that you learned, apply it, make a choice, and then you see the consequence of your choice. So if you do things like that, then you are creating already more context. So it is information combined with skills, the application. But then the crucial thing is that needs to fit in how you actually work in your company. There's no point in doing a generic thing. So this is how people do this in general. No, how do we do it for, if I speak of my own company, Easygenerator, so how do we do stuff at Easygenerator and not how do we do it in general? So it needs to be specific, and that is very important. And the way that we go about it, so Easygenerator is an authoring tool. It's an authoring tool for employees, for subject matter experts. So it's not for L&D who create top-down courses, but it's for employees who know what is happening in the business and how things are done. And we call that approach employee-generated learning. And that learning, by definition, is context-rich because it's created by the people who are working in the context, who are the context. So if they write that content down, how do we do stuff at our company, then it becomes relevant automatically. So by making the move from knowledge, just knowledge, to more contextual learning, which also embodies the skills-based training, and having it created, or at least work closely together with SMEs, creating that content and how they actually do the job, then you also add that specific context to it.
And this seems, Kasper, even more important today, where I know many people who are probably on this webinar are using generative AI in some shape or form to be able to kind of create content or as a thought partner to kind of gather what they're going to write about. And I think one of the challenges with using these large language models is it often gives you the kind of common practices rather than the optimal practice for your particular context, right? That's how large language models work, right? There are like thousands of blogs that propagate one particular approach of doing something. It's largely going to lean in that particular way, and hence the reason why you have biases and assumptions. And I think to kind of move away from that, propagating the common practice and instead choosing the optimal practice, the employee plays a critical role in kind of helping you curate, but also bring that organizational context to that learning that makes it relevant.
Yes,
and I do
correct.
want to kind of connect the dots with people around the relevance of relevance, right? Because the reason why relevant learning will help L&D stay relevant is because without it, the problem L&D teams tend to suffer is what we call the engagement gap. And I know, Kasper, me and you have spoken about this, is where this idea of you're pushing content out without the context, which means people are not engaging, right? I'm sure many of you have been experienced this where you've pushed out content, no one engages. You then send a chaser email to your managers going, managers, can you please ask the employees to do it? They ask them, nothing changes. You then chase the employees to do it. They're not doing it. Then all else fails. You make it mandatory just to get them to do it, right? We've all been there. And that's the engagement gap. And that often happens when people in the organization don't see the relevance of it. And if they're not seeing the relevance, they're not engaging. And if they're not engaging, that's the fastest way for both the employees and the executive team to start thinking about L&D as a kind of irrelevant part of the puzzle, so to speak, when they're thinking about the business. And so that's why it's really important you are delivering relevant learning. Are there any best practices you've seen, Kasper, in terms of how you can bring employees into the process of providing that context? What have you seen organizations do well?
Yeah. So I think that the key thing is that there are like two approaches to learning. So one is a top-down approach where you push learning to them, and then you get that engagement gap because you want them to learn something, and then they don't want to learn it because they don't see the reason why they should, and they don't see the benefit of it. So then you have that gap. So it should be the other way around. I think that the learner should be in charge. So the learner, if they have a learning need, then we as L&D need to make sure that we facilitate that learning need, that they can find content. So that's also why I don't like learning management systems, because learning management systems apply that it's about the managing of the learning. So it's like the top-down approach. So L&D is managing the learning. And for certain things like the compliance training, you need to have that tracking and tracing, and you need to push content. But as we said, that's sort of check the box and forget about it. So where you make the impact is where somebody is working and they can't do something. They hit a problem, or something has been changed, or they don't know how to do certain things. So then they need to have solutions. So either they need a quick answer, or they need a short course that will solve the problem, or they find out that they actually lack more information. So then they are motivated to go into a learning system. So I don't call it a learning management system, but into a learning system where they can take a short course to fill the gap in their skills or their knowledge. So go back to their job and actually finish what they started. So the mindset is very different. So the initiative lies with the learner. And that means that per definition, you don't have that engagement gap. And the
Yeah.
other thing, by the way, that's because I was touching briefly on employees creating learning content. That's the other thing. So I think that if you look at top-down learning, you push learning to the learner. The way that I was now describing it, it's like a bit like with TV and Netflix. You can compare it like that. So the old school approach is like a television broadcasting station. So you create a program, and me as a viewer can turn the TV on. I have to follow your lead. So news at 8, a soap at 8:20, and a movie at 9. And if I want something different, bad luck. And now we have the streaming media. So then we talk about the Netflix. They have very much the same content. They still have the soaps, they still have the series, they still have the movies, but they're just sitting there waiting for me as a viewer to go in. So the initiative is now with the learner. But I think it even has to go a step further. So if you look at social media, and that started with YouTube, and we now have Instagram and TikTok and things like that, that actually made from the viewer a producer. With YouTube, you can actually create your own channel. You can become a producer of content. And that is what tools like Easygenerator also try to do. They create out of a learner, we make a teacher of them. So they teach their experiences, they teach their knowledge to their peers, and that way you get that engagement per definition. So it's not just the learning where you want to engage, you want actually to have them share the knowledge and want them to become the teachers, and then you're fully engaged.
Yeah, I guess this raises, I mean, it's one of the reasons why we ask this question of, do you still need L&D? And really what we're asking is the current role of L&D still necessary? Because like you said, generative AI and the advancement in technology is just making it easier and easier for an end user like me to be able to self-serve and get personalized learning that's relevant in my moment of need. Right. So I'm able to do that now. And, I'm sure many people in the organizations where we work are probably using like ChatGPT to be able to get exactly what learning or knowledge that I need in that moment of need. And they were prior to ChatGPT, they were probably going to Google to search for what they needed and finding what they needed anyway. So the
Correct.
reality is now or before, if L&D isn't meeting the needs of the individual in the organization, people will find the learning they need anyway, which kind of raises the question of, in this kind of modern landscape, what is the role of L&D, right? Where if we say the kind of traditional setup of L&D's role was really kind of creating the content and almost like a factory with instructional designers churning out a bunch of content, and really they were seen as the owners of learning and development in the organization. But it seems like to be relevant, that ownership really needs to change. Would you agree with that, Kasper? Do you think that ownership needs to shift?
I agree, but I don't think it needs to shift, because I think it actually has never been ours. So it's really interesting, because if I spoke to the learning manager of DHL, which is a customer of ours, and they describe the learning landscape as an iceberg, where L&D is managing the tip of the iceberg, which is above the surface, which is like the mandatory training, which is fine. But there's a whole bunch of learning from the business bottom up happening with PowerPoints, PDFs, presentations, talks, whatever, trainings that L&D is not even aware of. So you are not owning that at all at the moment. And at Danone, for example, they call that shadow learning. So also The mandatory training, which is basically the training which is in the lights, that is visible for L&D, but all the other learning, which is the majority of learning, are already happening in the business. And with tools like Easygenerator, you can actually bring that learning out in the light and make sure that you facilitate it. And that's what you're going to do. So it's not who owns the training, because I think it remains the same. L&D remains responsible for the top-down learning. The business remains responsible for the bottom-up learning. But you, as L&D, you have a lot of knowledge on how to facilitate training. You know about the tools, you know about the processes, you know about instructional design, you know a lot of things. You know when people need certain information and when they do not need that information. So what your role becomes is a facilitator for the business to create the right content, to have the right content at the right moment. So that's a very different role than, so it's more the shift of roles than the shift of ownerships, I think.
Yeah, I think I see that shift of role into a more kind of strategic enabler of learning. And I think that's a big shift. I think if you've kind of historically been in L&D teams and operated in L&D teams where your role was to be the only people creating the content, the only people pushing the content, and now actually you're shifting away from just having that content focus to really, being the architects of a learning ecosystem, right? Well, one of my favorite questions to ask in a room full of L&D people is often to go, and let's do it today. I want you all to think about the last thing that you learned that had a big impact on your performance and career. Take a moment to think about it. Now, if that learning took place inside an LMS, I want you to put it on the chat. Now, I asked this question in a room full of hundreds and hundreds of people, and I think I've had one person one time put their hand up to say that most influential bit of learning took place in the LMS. And that's ironic, given most L&D people in those rooms at some point have bought an LMS or will be buying an LMS and forcing other employees to come to an LMS to learn. Yet when you ask them how they learn, it's often things like coaching from a peer or mentoring from a peer, a blog, a podcast, a webinar, an ebook. And the reality is there's a very diverse and rich ecosystem of knowledge and learning that exists. And so where the role shift needs to happen is where, rather than L&D feeling like they have to be the ones who created and bought everything that's in that ecosystem, is actually being the architect of that ecosystem, bringing it together, and most importantly, taking the friction out of people being able to access the relevant learning in that ecosystem. And so I do think it's the enablers of making sure, people are going to find that blog and find that podcast with or without L&D. But the idea is you can help make sure you're aligning that learning to the context that we spoke about earlier, to make sure you're telling them this is relevant and this is why it matters, and take the friction out of access. The other thing I'd flag is L&D's role in setting up the guardrails and guidelines for how learning can happen within the organization. For example, curation, right? You're not the only ones who are going to be curating. In fact, you want everyone within the organization, in particular your people managers, to be curating relevant learning for the organization. But you do want to empower that with the right guardrails and guidelines. And I wonder whether you've seen, Kasper, where, when you're getting employees to capture what they know and share it with the organization, I'm sure you get this objection, because I hear it often, where people are worried about, what if they share the wrong thing? What if it's kind of inaccurate? And, how do we moderate this? And, maybe I need to review everything before it gets published to the rest of the organization. What can L&D's role be there to kind of support that employee-generated learning?
Yeah, so I think that's, well, again, because it's already happening right now, because people are sharing that, but now in PDFs, and it's the iceberg that you don't see, or the shadow learning. So the thing is that you're not aware of it, but people are already doing that, and maybe they are teaching each other the wrong things. By the way, I really believe that organizations have like a self-healing method for that. So if I say something which is rubbish to my coworkers, they will tell me, wait a minute, that's not correct, and they will make sure that I change that. So there's a feedback mechanism anyway. But I think that it's really important that you are aware that that kind of content is different from that perspective. So that is really important, and it goes beyond learning content. You touched on that. So the model that we were talking about actually has 4 elements. So it's like the independent learning, which is e-learning. So then you talk about an SME together with L&D or by itself, creating learning content that people can use, and that needs to be more skills-based. The second step is when you are using a blended mode. So then the SME very often is also a trainer, or sometimes somebody between the business and L&D. So they are partly L&D, but they're coming from the business, so they know what's happening. So they train people. So once you have been learning information and a skill in your independent learning, in your e-learning, and you have practiced it there, they take it to the next level with trainer. You can practice this in real life. So it's not a working situation, still learning. Very often the third step, and then again an SME comes in. When you're working as a newbie in the job, you probably have a coach or a mentor that will guide you, which is a more experienced person. And then again, learning is happening. And then the fourth step is when you're an accomplished worker, then you learn from your peers and you give feedback to your peers. And that whole process, learning is happening. And in the ideal situation as L&D, you facilitate that. So let's say that you and I are working together, and you are coaching me as a newbie in a territory, and you teach me something. That's just a one-on-one interaction. So what our role as L&D could be to have things installed that actually pick up that learning and put it in a place when, if it's relevant for other people, it also becomes visible. So it's not just a one-on-one thing that we're doing, but it has a bigger impact. So those are the things that L&D can do. So it's really sort of being in the background of the process already happening, making sure they're happening in the right way, but also making them available for other people and things like that. So I think it's much more
Yeah,
like that.
I really like that, Casper. I can really relate to that because I know a lot of our customers use. We've got the HowNow app for kind of Slack and Microsoft Teams, and as you know, right, there's a lot of that knowledge sharing that's already happening, and it's often
Correct.
happening in these chat tools. But the problem is, all of that good knowledge that gets shared in Slack or Teams gets lost in the stream of conversation, and there's often poor SMEs who are stuck there answering the same questions over and over again. And one of the things I know a lot of our customers do about integration is you can capture that knowledge in the chat and convert it into a HowNow nugget that then gets kind of saved, stored, organized, and people can then search and surface it. And you end up kind of building this kind of collective brain and building this search first culture where instead of asking the same questions over and over again, you actually search this place first because people are going to store it there. And if you don't find it there, then you ask that question and you start to really build the sustainable way of tackling knowledge retention. Because often, I don't know whether you see this, and I can really feel employee generated learning supporting this idea of solving a leaky bucket problem, right? Where we often see you've got someone who's been in the company for 5 years, they learn a bunch of great stuff in the company, and then they leave the company. And all of that good stuff leaves with them. And essentially, you have a leaky bucket where you have to now relearn the things that you once knew. And the problem is, at the rate of current change, no company can afford to relearn the things that they once knew, right? There's just enough time for us to learn the new things that we need to learn. And that's why really tackling that knowledge retention problem it is really, really important. And I can really see how employee generated learning can support that. Just
Correct.
before we move on,
Yeah.
go on, Kasper.
It's actually one of the business cases, and by the way, this example days before I was joining Easygenerator, so they from my previous job, I actually worked with an aircraft company that they were the only one who built those planes, and their workforce was pretty old, so they had like a vast group of people with a lot of knowledge leaving the company and taking the knowledge with them. So they had a whole program where we captured the knowledge, but also they were working already with buddies to transfer the knowledge in order to retain that knowledge, because that is a big difference. And you will still lose knowledge and experience and somebody leaves your company, but you can sort of diminish the impact of that. And I think indeed this is a great example. If you are able to capture those kind of things, and it's also it connects back to what we're saying. That is the specific knowledge that creates the context. That is the knowledge that is valuable. That is the knowledge that ChatGPT doesn't have. If you are able to capture that knowledge as L&D and bring that back into the flow of learning while people are working, then things become really exciting. And then there's no question about have it being a value or whatever, then you are having a business impact, and people will ask you more and more to do more of that kind of stuff.
before I come on to the next bit we're going to talk about, I do want to say I'm going to come to your questions. So if you've got any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up as we come to it. We've kind of spoken to the point around tech being the disruptor here, Kasper, and you know, the advancement in Gen AI and other technologies is what's driving this question around, do we still need L&D? But tech can also play a role, right? Tech and generative AI can also play a role in L&D remaining relevant. So let's kind of talk about the positive stuff here, Kasper. How can we leverage generative AI, but also more holistically, technology in order to remain relevant?
Yeah. So with AI, you can do a lot of stuff. So one of the things, if you look at the learner side, it can create adaptive learning path. So it can help us serve the right learning content at the right moment. So it can change learning content or present other learning content in tools like HowNow at the right moment. So I think that is something where we can actually leverage AI. The other thing indeed is that next to the adaptive learning, it is that and it's something we already do as Easygenerator, we build in all kind of supportive features. So make it easier for people to create learning content, especially important because most of the people with Easygenerator are subject matter experts. So they are not instruction designers. So we need to make sure that they do it, that they can do it quickly, but also that they create proper learning content. And AI can help there. So you can, for example, you can generate questions with AI. So you can help things. But those are like supportive features. So they are not really changing the landscape, at least not yet. Same is with generating courses. So we have a course builder in Easygenerator where you upload information, we ask questions that are, we add didactics to the flow. You can upload information there, and then we can create a draft course for you. So it's helping you to do that. So there's all kind of technology that actually helps it. But I think that the biggest impact of AI will be the fact, well, you were talking about that corporate brain or gathering that corporate information. And that is actually what is happening with AI as we speak. So you already have ChatGPT that we mentioned a couple of times, which is like a go-to place for generic knowledge. And now tools are popping up, and Microsoft is working on that, but also other companies, but it's also part of some learning systems where you can actually gather that information and have like an AI bot like ChatGPT. You can just ask a question and you will get a specific answer from your organization. And you just need to sit back and think, what does that mean for my learning? So if your learning predominantly is knowledge-based learning, where you can just get a question and an answer, then you're probably in trouble because that can be covered by tools like that. So, and the other impact that it has is that the value of that kind of training diminishes. So it will still be there as part of that knowledge-based training, but if you don't add or the skills-based training, if you don't add that skills component, how people can actually use that information, then you lose the value. So you really need to make that step. So the corporate brain extra drives you in the direction of that skills-based training. So if you go there, if the learning that you create is focused on skills, and you also create that in the right context and make it happening at the right time, then you're in the right track.
Yeah, I like that. And I think you mentioning skills, right? I think one of the key problems, I'm sure you hear this as well, Kasper, when I speak to L&D professionals, is often around measuring business impact and demonstrating impact to the organization. And I actually think that's a key part of remaining relevant and getting business buy-in and getting engagement from the rest of the workforce. And I actually think tech can play a huge role in being able to build that impact narrative and communicate it back to the organization. You know, we touched on this at the beginning around the metrics you measure, right? Like it's saying time spent learning and course completion doesn't demonstrate business impact, but actually skills as a metric is a really powerful one of kind of building that impact narrative. If you're able to, and that's why often, you know, learning and skills we think is a great marriage, because what you really want to be able to do is ask the question of what skills are required to deliver your business strategy, and what skills do you have, right? Do you have the skills required to deliver your strategy? And once you identify those gaps, you really want to be able to connect people with those relevant learning opportunities to bridge those gaps. And then you really want to be able to measure the movement on that metric. Right? If I can say that 70% of my sales team engaged with learning opportunities A, B, and C, and after they engage with those learning opportunities, actually half of them improved their negotiation skills from a level 3 to a level 4. That's what the organization wants to hear, because you can then use that metric and combine that with performance data to say, well, actually, the impact of improving negotiation skill from level 3 to level 4 is that our sales cycle was shorter, right? And that's what the business wants to hear in order for us to be a strategic enabler and to really influence business performance and have an impact on the organization. And that entire workflow that I just said, tech can do that. We do this for organizations now in terms of tracking and showing the movement in skills and the relation to learning. But what I'm really excited about is what more you will be able to do, right? Like one of the areas we're really excited about is this idea of skills assessment and how you can leverage generative AI. If you think about this idea of a lot of the ways we assess skills today is we get a person to see another person applying that skill and then assess them against the criteria. Now, the great thing with generative AI, it can act as our eyes and ears today. And so it can, if you told it what good looks like and gave it the framework to be able to assess it, then it can act as your eyes and ears and essentially assess. And so you can now scale observational skill assessment to a level that you couldn't before. And I think these are the things really what we need to look at is how we can leverage tech to make it easier for us to connect relevant learning to the right person, but also to be able to measure and demonstrate that impact. Anything to add on that, Kasper, around what else we can use?
Because I totally agree with you. And the funny thing is that we're talking about new technologies and innovations and AI. So it sounds all like very futuristic and stuff like that. And the funny thing is that it is not. So I was rereading David Merrill, who is an educationalist from, I think his book is from 2002, and it's based on work, actually research from the 80s, from the previous century we're talking. So pre-mobile, pre-PC, pre-web, pre-anything. And he wrote down the principles of adult learning. And that is that it's problem oriented. So if there's no reason for you to learn, well, we're talking about the motivation. So if you don't have a reason to learn, if there's not a problem you want to solve, or you don't want something you want to improve, or if there's no reason, there's no point in learning. The second thing is that it is not information based, it is actually skills based. People want to be able to do something. So you don't learn for the learning, you learn to be able to actually apply that learning and make a change either in your private life or in your business. It depends on what you're learning. So the funny thing is that all the things that we're now talking about, they're sort of realizing what 20, 40 years ago was that, okay, these are the principles of adult learning. And we're now, and that's why I said, basically, there's nothing new because we know we have to do better. And a lot of us have been focusing on the wrong stuff, and we know that the value is not there. And if you look in the books, you know that the value is in that application and in those skills, and there's nothing new there. But now we have the tools to actually make that happen. So that's the good news. So the interesting thing of AI is, on one hand, it is a threat. So if you are doing the wrong things in the wrong way, then you can be actually replaced by AI, at least for a part. But it's also a huge opportunity because we know we need to do different stuff. And it's actually a window of opportunity that we can use that moment of change to actually start doing the right things in the right way and have that right business impact. And then you will automatically have that connection with the business, and you have automatically that value for the business.
I want to jump to a question that's just come in from Rochelle. So how will skills-based AI tracks and suggestions in an LMS shift live workshop learnings? And so we've already shifted to live workshops, to skills-based practice and discussion on tough case examples. Are there any other ideas on what the impact on live workshop learning? Any thoughts on that, Kasper?
So how we can use AI for live workshops?
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that you can actually do is help use AI for the preparation of those workshops. For example, very often in workshop, so let's say you are, I'm not sure what you're teaching, but let's say it's a sales training. Then you teach people actually the benefits of the stuff you're selling, and then they need to be able to apply that in a sales conversation. And you can actually practice that in a role play during a workshop. But you now can also, we are actually working at Easygenerator to create like an AI bot that will do that. So you tell that bot, so what is it? What kind of person do I need to play? So they actually can be playing the person you have to convince, you have to sell to. And then a BDR or an AE can actually start practicing already in his own home situation to that bot and will get feedback on the things that he's doing right and doing wrong. So you can already get prepared for that classroom face-to-face session. So that's one of the
Yeah.
things that you can actually do extra there.
One of the things I'd definitely recommend reading about if you haven't, Rochelle, is around the fully active learning model that the Minerva University put into play. It's some great learnings and research around, they were basically trying to invent what the modern day university, so to speak, how it should operate and what it would look like. And there's a lot of research they have around how we should lose our live workshop times. And I think some of it sounds quite obvious, but it's not often followed. For example, I still see today live workshops that are still pretty much sage on the stage, one person doing a lot of the talking, broadcasting a lot of information. Now, it's the best way to distribute information, but it's not the best way to learn. And so the reason why it gets done so often is because it's easy for people to distribute information in that format. But one of the things in the fully active learning model is really around making sure that type of information distribution happens asynchronous. And actually what you're using the live synchronous time for is, like you said, that problem-based or maybe role play practice, those scenarios, and really to put that critical thinking, challenging each other, the debates and discussions and problem solving into play. So definitely recommend reading about that.
Maybe to add on that, Nelson, because I think that also an old school model, but really powerful in this context, is the flipped classroom. So it was actually, so I think it dates back from the 90s, and it was sort of made active in the early 2000s. But the idea was, were two professors, they were lecturing, and then they gave an assignment to their students, and they found out that a lot of students, when they came back, didn't do their homework because they got stuck at home. So they started recording their lectures, and then gave the assignment in the classroom and worked with the students when they got stuck on solving those issues. And that model evolved from there. And we have a customer, Electrolux, who is using that. So they create how they build household compliances and sell that through a network of partners. So they have to train those partners. In the old days, trainers were traveling through Europe doing a 3-day course. But the thing is, if you are teaching people new stuff and learning them how to actually use that, to apply that at the same time, is really hard. You need time to process. So then if you actually put that information in an e-learning course, so you do that asynchronous beforehand, everybody can take on that content and learn that knowledge in his own time, in his own space. So everybody comes prepared to a session. And with them, they brought it back from 3 days to 1 day. There's 1 day training session. And then you actually are looking at the application of that knowledge. So then you do the role plays, but everybody already sort of has that knowledge. So you can really sort of up your game and impact that workshop. But that's nothing to do with AI. That's just like an old school learning model that's really powerful. And I really believe that things are never black and white. So it's not just AI or e-learning or face-to-face. I think if you look for the combination of the best of worlds, then you will have the biggest impact.
And I think that brings us nicely to not tech, but to talk about mindset. And I see a question around where's that research from? The book's name is Building the Intentional University. And so we can, in the follow-up notes, include a link to it. It's a great book on their journey and as well as the research they've done around different learning models and how they try to reinvent the university for those who are interested. So, like we said, Kasper, it's not just around tech, right? And a lot of these models, like you said, have been around for years. And so the kind of question comes to why are they not being adopted and put into practice? We all know what the theory is. And I often find this when I speak to people, not just in L&D and HR, but in other departments who talk about design thinking lean and agile. Everyone gets the concepts, but no one puts it into practice. And often I found the blocker is it's really the mindset, right? It's the mindset shift. And ironically, we're often in L&D worried about other people not changing their behaviors and falling behind, but we might actually become victims of that ourselves. And so what I wanted to kind of focus on is what are the mindset shifts that need to happen, Kasper, for us to remain relevant in L&D?
So I think that's a crucial thing. And I think we already touched on a lot of these elements because it is about letting go. So if you talk about learning management, it's talking about control. Letting go of that control is a key part. So you become an enabler, and an enabler doesn't have control. But it's a completely different ballgame because very often people ask me, so, well, if people are creating learning, and so how do we sort of measure the impact of that? And how do we actually, how do we hand out certificates, and how do we see if people fail or pass a course? And the interesting thing is that is not there. So fail and pass and certificates are interesting for that top-down approach if you need a certificate that I do comply to this new law. But if it's me sharing knowledge with you, it's just you picking up that knowledge. And if I put questions in that learning, that's not to test you, but that's for you to test if you actually got the point. So it's to support the learner. It's part of the learning. It's not an assessment that will lead to a grade. So it's a completely different ballgame. It's not about controlling. It's not about certificates. It's not about fail or pass. It is about enabling people to share their knowledge and to make sure they get the best out of that. And that's a completely different thing than what we very often have been used to do.
I love that. And I guess just to add a few to it, I think one of the big shifts we probably need to have is to kind of love the problem, not the solution. Because I think what we need to accept is just from the conversation we've had today, the solution is going to change quite a bit, right? How we arrive at that solution and how we bring it to life is going to change. You might be using generative AI for it. But what's true is 10 years ago, we should have been trying to tackle performance problems and business challenges. And today, we need to do the same. And 10 years from now, that's also what we need to do. So what we probably need to focus on more to remain relevant is making sure we're spending that upfront time on problem discovery and really defining that problem in a clear way, which aligns with the rest of the organization, that you're all aligned on what is the business challenge or performance problem that you're trying to solve. And the other one I would say is probably the shift towards being more outcome focused rather than output focused. I think historically, if you've built out an L&D function, which is very much kind of that factory model of producing courses after courses after courses, you were probably quite output focused, where your kind of value was in talking about, well, I generated 20 training programs, look how great we are. But actually that's not, it wasn't enough then. It's definitely not enough today, because actually what the business wants to know is what is the value you're bringing to the organization and what impact are you having? And so we need to start measuring the outcome. And, I'm a big believer, you achieve what you measure. A good example of that is, for any of you who are counting your steps, right? Before these smart watches, when did we ever think about walking 10,000 steps? Never. But the moment you start measuring 10,000 steps, we now all want to hit 10,000 steps. And the same is true for what you measure in the organization. If you're trying to measure 40 hours of learning, you're probably going to hit 40 hours of learning. It doesn't mean you've achieved your outcome. To be able to do that, the first step is measuring what that outcome metric is. Is it a performance metric? Is it a skill development metric that you're looking at? And so we need to measure the right things if we're going to achieve that and deliver the outcome. And I think we often talk about continuous learning. And in L&D, I think we need to put our hands up. We're often guilty of talking about continuous learning as if it's something someone else has to do. But it's also true for us. Right. It's also true for us to continuously improve and iterate on the ways we think about strategically, how we think about L&D and how we put it into practice. So there are definitely some of those things I think we need to change if we're going to remain relevant. And I'd love to hear if anyone's got thoughts on other mindset shifts that they've gone through, like you've gone through yourself, or others you'd recommend. And And any other questions that you have? There's one question that's come through, Kasper, which is around AI programs of tech that can do assessments. I can talk about skills-based assessments, but why don't you tell us around, you touched on it a bit there around creating quizzes and assessments, etc. Do you want to talk a bit more about how you guys do that within Easygenerator?
Yeah, so what we currently do is that, for example, we have a feature we call Easy AI that can do a number of things. And one of the things it can actually do is create questions. And I think one of the few features that actually brings added value from AI at the moment, because we can also do summaries and stuff like that, but you could also copy and paste into ChatGPT, you would get the same. But for example, question generation, to create questions is really hard. And create good questions is even harder. And with AI, you can actually do that in the format of Easygenerator. So you get a whole bunch of them. You can just pick out the ones you like. You can edit them and put them in. So that is really helpful. But it's only the beginning because as I said, it's always blended. So the other thing that we have in Easygenerator is that we also use learner data to see how good a course is performing. And for example, how good a question is performing. And if everybody answers the question correct or incorrect, the question doesn't have any value. So you have all kind of mathematical calculations that you can do that. So we actually use the learner data for the author to flag, wait a minute, this question is not correct. And we already do both things. So we do the flagging for author, this you have to fix this question, and we do the question generation. And what is next is actually we'll bring that together. So then with the data and the AI and the content that you create as an author, those three elements will actually create a lot of value for you creating questions like that. So it's features like that. But the other thing that I think is, and especially if we talk about subject matter experts creating learning content, we are all being, so I'm a teacher myself originally. So I started out like 40 years ago as a teacher. And we're all trained, and especially the older generation like me, we're trained in transferring information, transferring knowledge. We're not trained in transferring experiences or teaching skills. So that's different. So, and we did some experiments. So if we ask anyone, can you share whatever you know or whatever your experience is on this topic, they will share information. So that is the other part where AI comes in. So we are actually building an AI bot, let's call it an AI instructional designer that looks over the shoulder of the SME and will actively help them to create more actionable skills-based learning, because they will not do that by themselves. So if you put in the features like a scenario or like whatever things we can come up with in the tool, people will probably ignore them because it's easier just to write down what you know. And then AI comes into play, and I think it should be even an active. It's not just suggesting to you, maybe you should do this in a different way and add an image or interaction or made it more actionable. No, it could actually pick up a page that you wrote and say, wait a minute, I can turn this into a scenario. Do you like that? And then you can continue here. So I think we need to push especially the SMEs, the people without the instructional design knowledge, more and more in that direction. But as we said, it's also a mind shift also for instructional designers. I created learning content in myself as well, and I think I was guilty as well. Those things were also content heavy and not really skills based. So even for instructional designers, it's sort of a wake up call that we need to create content that moves in a direction. If it's not applicable, it doesn't really have business value. That's the bottom line.
I love that. The holy grail is learning applied equals profit. And that's if you're doing your job right. And we've got a few more questions come in and I want to squeeze it in. But before we jump to the kind of next question, you've heard a bit about Easygenerator and HowNow throughout this session. If you'd like to know more, in a nutshell, Easygenerator really is a state-of-the-art authoring tool. We partner with them. We love partnering with them. And I know a lot of customers love using it too, to really empower your subject matter experts to very easily create modern learning experiences that are contextually relevant and going to get that engagement. You can integrate that with HowNow. We're a learning and skills platform some of you may be familiar with, but we essentially help you identify those skills gaps in your organization, connect those learning experiences to those gaps, and really deliver that learning in the flow of work so you can get that engagement and have impact on your business. So shortly, you should see a poll pop up on your screen. You can either choose an individual. You either want to see HowNow, Easygenerator, or both, and we can show you how both of these platforms work together. So pick which one you want, and someone from the respective teams will follow up. A question that has come in, Kasper, is around getting buy-in, which is a really good point, because there might be many people on this session who are like, you know what, I know I need to change. But my organization and the way processes and the way business thinks is not set up in a way where it's easy for me to change the direction and change our approach. And so, how do I get the rest of the business and executive team to buy in to the changes I want to make so I can remain relevant? Any kind of suggestions around how we can get that executive buy-in?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think we already answered that for a part, because if you were going to the business with the message, well, your employees on average spend 40 hours on learning, then probably the mindset from the operational managers, that had cost me 40 hours of productive time. So if you go there, so okay, we are going to change that, and we want to have the discussion on what kind of problems do people encounter while they're working? What kind of skills are they missing? What kind of solutions can we bring to them that will help them do their job better? You will always have somebody who will listen to you and will work with you. So I think it's a pretty easy sale. Should be.
Yeah, I think the other one I'll add to is, if anyone on this session has had a budget pulled or a budget pushed, I often find that's because your business case probably didn't have a compelling why now. And what I mean by that is, the reality is everyone hates change. Even the people who say they love change, they're lying to you. They hate change. And there's actually an incredible study that I think it was University of Hertfordshire did, and they found 73% of people would stick with what they're doing, even if they knew the change would bring better results. That's how much people hate change. But there's only one thing that can help people who hate change. And that's a really big change that you can't ignore. And that's the why now. The why now is really like an alarm clock. When it goes off, you can't ignore it. And what you need to be able to give in your business case to get that buy-in is to explain what is that big change that's making the current status quo completely unacceptable, and why sticking with the current status quo will form to be a threat and dangerous, in some cases fatal to the organization. And often that's missing in business cases, right? Like I see business cases where L&D and HR teams use the kind of usual, it will improve productivity, it will improve retention. That's great. But why now, right? Like, why can't I get you to do it in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time? And that's where, an example of a why now might be you've got high employee turnover. And when you dig into the data, maybe in your exit interviews, you're finding a common theme, which is a lack of learning and growth opportunities. And so you now need to say, okay, that carries on for another 12 months. Essentially, we're going to have empty seats, which means there's missed opportunity. Then there's the cost of replacing that hire. Then there's the cost of ramp up. Now, if this carries on, for every month that this carries on, this cost is going to get bigger. And this is what that looks like. That's a why now. Because I now know for every time I push your budget by another quarter, this cost of inaction is going to get bigger and more expensive for the organization. And that's what compels someone to act. I've not even told you what the solution is, right? It's not about the solution. It's about why we need to act now. And so I'd really recommend really nailing your why now in that. I don't feel we've got any questions come in. But Kasper, a lot of what we've been speaking about is what we need to do. Any final thoughts to kind of inspire that kind of change amongst our L&D peers before we leave?
So, sorry, I was just looking at the chat. So I sort of
Any final thoughts? Any final thoughts of inspiration?
Well, yeah, I think if you are talking about why now, because I really liked that, then you can also apply that to the current conversation. So why now? Because, well, this is the moment, and this is the window of opportunity you need to use. And if you if you recognize yourself being on the wrong side of history, then well, time to move, and things will get fast, will move fast. So it's not like, okay, let's take a few years and then see how things are going. Then you are probably already obsolete and looking for a new job. So it is really a matter of not only survival of the L&D department and you with your job, but it's also way more interesting. So this is your opportunity to actually have a business impact, to actually bring learning into the flow of work. And well, if you have any learning heart, then that should be starting beating faster because that is exciting. So I think those are the why nows. I think for that. So I think that a lot of things were covered, but I think that the main thing is, and that's also the mindset thing, you need to get into action. You need to critically look at what you're doing. You need to look, am I doing the right things? And are those things still relevant in a year from now? Not in 5 years, but in a year or maybe in 3 months from now.
Yeah,
And then start doing the right things. And you probably know which things you should stop doing and which things you should start doing. By the way, that's another lesson that I learned. If you want to do something new, you also has to stop doing something else because you have to get like the room for that. So that's like an interesting exercise you can do. So what are you going to do next as an improvement, and what are you going to drop as an old school thing that you don't need anymore?
I love that. The change starts with us, and that's a great note to finish on. Kasper, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure. We will follow up with an email with a recording of the session and any links and references we've mentioned. And would love to hear your feedback. So when you close out, you'll realize there's a little feedback form that pops up asking you what you like, what you didn't like, and what we can improve. And until next time, thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.